My father had not known my name in 4 years. And then, one Tuesday afternoon in late autumn, he sat up in bed, looked directly at the window, and told me the river was low today because the rains had been late. I want you to hear what I just said. He sat up on his own. A man whose spine had not straightened without assistance since the second winter of his decline, whose hands had not gripped a spoon in 18 months, whose eyes had for most of that time looked through me the way a person looks through a pane of glass at something farther away. He sat up as if someone had quietly untied a knot inside him. And then he began to speak in complete, ordered, cheerful sentences about a fishing trip he had taken with his younger brother in the summer of 1984. 41 years ago, on a stretch of creek I had never in my life heard him mention, using the name of a brother who had been dead for 4 decades. I should tell you what I am because it matters for the part that comes next. I am a hospice nurse. I have been one for 22 years. I have sat with somewhere north of 400 people in the final days and hours of their lives. I have watched the body do what the body does, the modeling of the feet, the shift in breathing, the long spaces between breaths that lengthen and lengthen until one of them simply does not have the next one after it. I know the stages. I know the timeline. I know what a brain with advanced neurological disease can and cannot do, because I have held the charts in my hands, and I have seen what the imaging looks like, and I have been trained by physicians who do not traffic in sentiment. What I am telling you is that the thing I watched my father do for the next 47 minutes was, by every clinical yardstick I had ever been taught, impossible. And I am telling you that I have not been the same nurse since. I have not been the same daughter. I have not been the same woman. Because somewhere in the middle of those 47 minutes, he stopped describing the river, and he started describing something else. Something he should not have been able to see from a hospice bed in a room with the curtains drawn. Something I am only now, years later, ready to say out loud on a recording that strangers will hear. The clinical term for what happened to my father is terminal lucidity. You can look it up. It is in the medical literature. It has been documented for more than 2 centuries in patients with dementia, with late-stage Alzheimer's, with tumors that should have left nothing intact. Patients who suddenly, without warning and without explanation, return. They know the room. They know the faces. They speak in the full grammar of the people they used to be. And then, usually within hours and almost always within a day, they are gone. The textbooks describe it as if it were a flare, a last burst of electricity from a system that is closing down. I used to describe it that way too. I used it in training sessions with new nurses. I said the word flare the way a person says a word they do not want to examine too closely, because examining it would open a door. I am going to tell you what I saw inside that door. My father was sitting up. His eyes, the eyes that had been unfocused for years, the eyes that had slid off every face in the room, like water running off a windshield. His eyes were present, not the eyes of a sick man rallying, the eyes of a young man looking out a kitchen window on a summer morning and deciding where to spend the day. There was no fog in them. There was not even the residue of fog. Wherever my father had been for the last 4 years, he was no longer there. He was here, in the room with me, For the first time since before the disease took his vocabulary apart, word by word, like someone dismantling the sentence he no longer wanted to be in, and his voice. I want to be careful about this, because the voice is the part I still cannot hear in memory without my throat tightening. The disease had taken his voice first, years before it took anything else. He had gone from the man who used to read aloud at the dinner table to a man who could only make sounds in the shape of words without the words actually being inside them. What came out of his mouth on that Tuesday afternoon was not the cracked, uncertain voice of the man in the bed. It was the voice he had used when I was 7 years old, and he was explaining to me how to tie a lure. Steady, warm, a little amused at his own story. A voice from a room in my memory I had not walked into in 35 years. He said, "The light on that creek, sweetheart. You wouldn't believe it. It's coming through the leaves, the way it used to come through the leaves at the old place. Your uncle says hello. He says it's still the best fishing he's ever had. He says the trout here never get tired, and they never stop jumping." My uncle, his brother, the one who had drowned in 1984 at 26 years old in a boating accident on a lake 4 states away from any creek my father had ever fished in. I had 30 seconds to decide what kind of nurse I was going to be. The one who charted confusional episode, redirected patient gently, and made a note about medication. Or the one who listened. I listened. I pulled the chair close to his bed. I did what 22 years of training had told me never to do in situations like this. I took his hand, and I asked him to tell me more, not to redirect him, not to bring him gently back to the room, to tell me what he was seeing. And my father, the man who 4 hours earlier had been unable to recognize a glass of water, my father turned his head toward me, looked at me with the exact expression of tender mischief he used to use when he was about to let me in on something no one else was supposed to know. And he started describing a world. The creek first. He said the water was so clear you could count the stones on the bottom, and that every stone had a color he didn't remember stones being allowed to have. Rust and ember, and the particular blue that the sky gets about 15 minutes before a summer storm. He said the current was moving the way water moves when it has finally stopped being in a hurry. "It's not running anywhere," he said. "It's just being water. That's all it's doing. And it's enough." He said the light was coming down through the trees in long honeyed columns, and that if you held your hand into one of the columns, it felt warm the way a mother's hand feels warm on your forehead when you are a child who has been running a fever. He said there was no heat and there was no cold. He said the air itself had a taste, like the first sip of something you didn't know you were thirsty for. He said, and then he laughed, the kind of laugh I had not heard in 5 years. And then he said, "I don't know how I'm supposed to tell you about the smell of it. There isn't a word. You'd have to be here." He said his brother was beside him on the bank. Not young, not old. "He looks like himself," my father said. "He looks the way he was supposed to look if nothing had ever hurt him." And then he said something I am going to repeat exactly, because I wrote it down the moment I could get to a notepad afterward. And the notepad is still in the drawer beside the bed I am sleeping in tonight. He said, "Everybody here looks the way they were supposed to look if nothing had ever hurt them. Everybody, which meant there were others. I asked. He smiled at me the way a man smiles when a child has finally asked the right question. And then he started naming them. He named my mother, his wife, who had gone 9 years ahead of him, and he described her in a green dress I had never seen her wear in my entire life, a dress she had apparently owned before I was born. I would find out 3 months later, going through an old shoebox of photographs my aunt had kept, that my mother had in fact owned exactly such a dress in 1971, 2 years before she met my father. He had never seen it either. It had been packed away before they married. He named a cousin I had only heard about in passing, a boy who had died of fever at 4 years old, in a country my family left before I was born. He described the cousin as running around out there like he'd been storing up that running his whole life. He described the field behind the creek, because now it was a field, and he was telling me about it the way a man describes a landscape he is standing in, and not the way a man describes a dream. He said people were walking in the field, not marching, not processing, not doing anything solemn. Walking, he said, the way you walk when you finally come home from a long trip and you're just letting your feet remember the yard. He said some of them were laughing at nothing in particular, the way people laugh when a weight they have been carrying for decades has been quietly taken off their shoulders and set down somewhere. They will not need it again. And then he told me about the animals. And that is the part I have not told anyone until now, because it is the part that convinced me I was not listening to a dying brain. I was listening to a man who had been given a window. There were dogs in the field, and horses, and creatures I did not recognize from his description. Creatures he seemed delighted to be describing, precisely because he could not place them himself. The dogs, he said, were moving between the people. Going to every hand that's open, he said, and every hand out there is open. The horses were standing quietly in the long grass, and people were walking up to them and pressing their foreheads against the horses' foreheads, the way children press their foreheads against the foreheads of animals they love. And the horses were letting them. And nothing in the field was afraid of anything else in the field. "There's no fear here," my father said, and his voice went very soft when he said it. I didn't know how much of my life was fear until I got here, and there wasn't any. The animals were not running to any one person in particular. They were moving through the crowd the way joy moves through a crowd, touching every face, settling nowhere, leaving a little of themselves with everyone they passed. And the people in the field. My father said they were all in the bloom of whatever had been best in them. The old ones upright, the young ones complete, the sick ones whole. Nobody here is bent by anything anymore, he said. Not by pain, not by years, not by the things that got done to them. They're just themselves, all the way through, for the first time. And then he looked at me, really looked at me, the way he had looked at me when I was 19 and had come home from college to tell him I was dropping out. And he had sat across the kitchen table from me and asked me one question that took me 20 years to understand. He said, "Sweetheart, I spent most of my life worried about the wrong things." I started to cry then. I am not going to pretend I was composed. I was a 22-year hospice veteran, and I was crying in the chair beside a bed I had sat beside 100 times before, because my father who had not formed a coherent sentence in years, was telling me the thing I had needed him to tell me since I was a child and had never been able to ask him for. "I was worried about the mortgage," he said. "I was worried about what the neighbors thought. I was worried about the car. I was worried about a promotion I didn't even want. I was worried about whether I was doing it right. All of it, every bit of it. And the whole time, the thing that was actually being asked of me was so much smaller and so much bigger than any of that. I just needed to love you well, and to love your mother well, and to pay attention to the one who made all of this." And here he gestured toward the window, toward the field he was seeing and I was not. Instead of filing him away for Sundays, he said, "I thought I was running out of time my whole life. I was running out of the wrong kind of time, the kind of time that was never mine to begin with. The other kind, the kind that matters, is so much bigger than I understood that I am almost embarrassed at how small I made my own life, trying to protect something that was never in danger." And he said one more thing, and I am going to give it to you exactly, because it is the sentence I now write on the inside cover of every journal I start. "A life spent chasing what rusts is a life spent polishing a chain." He was tired after that. Not in the way sick people are tired, in the way a man is tired at the end of a good day. The clean tiredness of someone who has done the thing he came to do and is ready to put his tools down and sit on the porch. He looked at the window one more time. Whatever he was seeing through it had not changed for him. I could tell by his face that the field was still there, that his brother was still there, that whatever was waiting for him was simply waiting now instead of calling. And then he turned back to me and he squeezed my hand with the strength of the father I had not felt in his grip for 4 years. And he said the last words I am ever going to hear him say in this life. He said, "Don't be sad for me, honey. I'm not going anywhere far. It's going to feel like I stepped into the next room. And when you come through after me, however long it takes, it's going to feel to me like you were right behind me the whole time." Then he lay back against the pillow. Not the collapse of an exhausted patient, the settling of a man lying down on his own terms. He closed his eyes. His breathing slowed the way breathing slows when sleep is coming honestly. And a little after midnight, without any of the struggle I had been trained to expect at the end, he was gone. The attending physician on call that night was a woman I had worked with for 9 years. She knew my father's chart. She knew what his imaging had looked like 6 months earlier. When I told her the next morning what had happened in those 47 minutes, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said something I had never heard her say. And she is not a woman given to saying things like this. She said, "I've seen it before. Not often, but more than once. And every single time, the family describes the same kind of window." I have been quiet about this story for a long time, and I will tell you why. I was afraid that if I said it out loud, someone would hand me a clinical explanation that would take it away from me. Someone would tell me it was a burst of residual neural activity. Someone would tell me it was wishful hearing on my part. Someone would fold what my father saw into a paragraph in a textbook and close the book. But I have sat with 400 dying people, and I am going to tell you what 22 years on the quiet side of that door have taught me. The dying do not lie. Not at the end. The end is the one place in a human life where the performance finally stops, where the mask a person has been carrying since childhood gets too heavy to hold up anymore. And what comes out from behind the mask is the simplest, most honest version of the person who was wearing it. If my father had been hallucinating, the hallucination would have been stitched out of the scraps of his failing brain. It would have been confused. It would have contradicted itself. It would have dissolved when I asked a clarifying question. Instead, it answered me. It described a dress my mother wore before he met her. It named a cousin he had never told me about. It rearranged nothing. It simply reported. My father was not shown the place where my mother and his brother are living right now, because they are not living there right now. They are asleep so deep and so merciful that the distance between the last breath of this life and the first breath of the restored, one will feel to them like no distance at all, like the half second it takes to close your eyes and open them again in a room full of morning light. What my father was given in those 47 minutes was a preview. A window opened into the morning that is still coming. The Creator who made him and made me and made all of us pulled the curtain aside for a moment and let a dying man see what the long wait is actually pointing at. And here's what I want you to take with you when this video ends. If you have lost someone, they are not far from you in the way you are afraid they are. They are not wandering some lonely in-between. They are not waiting in a room without windows. They are resting in a way that you and I, still down here, wearing the weight of every day, cannot yet imagine. The years you will spend missing them will, on their side, be nothing at all. When they open their eyes, you will already be there. Because the time between now and that morning does not exist on their side of the pillow. And what my father told me about the way he spent his life, the worrying about the wrong things, the filing away of the Creator for later, is the one piece of his long silence that I think he was brought back out of to deliver. Not as a warning, as a kindness. He was telling me, and he would want me to tell you, don't wait until a window opens in your own last room to realize what was actually being asked of you the whole time. The task is not complicated. It was never complicated. Reach every day a little farther toward the one who made you, not through any particular building, not in the exact way your neighbor does it, just with a quiet, honest, daily hunger to know the maker of that field and to live in a way he would recognize when he finally turns his face toward you and says your name. That is the whole thing. Everything else is smaller than it looks from down here. Tell me in the comments, whose face are you most hoping to see when that morning comes? And what is the first sentence you are going to say to them? I read every single one, and I remember more of them than you would think. And if this story was a small mercy to you tonight, if it loosened something in your chest, even a little, please share it with someone who is sitting in a room beside someone they are not ready to lose. There might be a window in that room, too. You never know when the curtain is going to move.